I wouldn't say this was the best intercession course, but it's certainly in the top one. I thought I would begin today's lecture by paraphrasing a one-liner from Brian Clough, the celebrated English soccer manager of the 70s and early 80s and the subject of the film Damned United, who was famed for his pithy wit as much as for his successes on the pitch. But before we turn to Clough and the biopic of his time at Leeds United, let us first take a look at a text that I see as a useful introduction to the course as a whole. John Doyle's introduction to his 2010 book, The World is a Ball, The Joy, Madness and Meaning of Soccer. Doyle was born in County Tipperary in Ireland, but moved to Canada in the 1980s. And since 2000, he's been the TV critic for the Canadian newspaper, The Globe and Mail. Doyle begins his book by recounting his experience of watching a game between Iran and Ireland in a Toronto bar. This reminded me, now when Doyle talks about this, he really emphasises the internationalist spirit of camaraderie between the two opposing fans. But this experience that he recounts at the beginning of the book reminds me very strongly of my own experience, which was rather different, watching a World Cup match in 1998 in a sports bar in Massachusetts. And this World Cup match was between England and Argentina. It was during the World Cup in France. And I was there with my wife, Ellen, who's American but is willing to indulge my passion for soccer because it's exotic and not American football. Now this bar in which we were in was roughly divided half and half between English and Argentinian fans. Now before the match, ESPN in its infinite wisdom decided to up the stakes by showing footage of the war that took place between the UK, between England as people outside the UK like to call it, and Argentina, this war that was fought in the early 80s over the Falkland Islands. Now, as we're watching this footage of planes taking off and aircraft carriers, etc., you could have heard a pin drop. No one was making eye contact with the people in the supporting the opposing team. Fortunately, the tension dissipated and the game started, and England, as they always do in every World Cup practically, lost on penalties. At the end, my wife Ellen offered this observation: well, the Argentinians are certainly better looking. Words of comfort, indeed. So to return to Doyle in his pub in Toronto, watching his match between Ireland and Iran, you can see that he's coming to the World Cup from outside the field of sports journalism and bringing a fresh perspective and above all a keen eye for cultural meanings and cultural signification to this spectacle of international soccer. As you read this excerpt, I want you to think about how his interests and priorities deviate from the standard preoccupations of sports journalism. What catches his attention? How does he interpret the significance of soccer beyond the events on the pitch? Turning to the 2009 film, The Damned United, we can see that this movie depicts a unique moment in British soccer culture through a unique figure, the incredibly boastful, opinionated and successful manager, Brian Clough. In the modern game, in the contemporary game, I think we have to look to a figure like Jose Mourinho to find an equivalent combination of arrogance and achievement. When he came to England to manage the London team Chelsea, Mourinho famously described himself at a press conference as the special one, an almost messianic declaration of intent. However, Mourinho achieved great success with big clubs, with long traditions of success and enormous financial resources. Porto in Portugal, Chelsea in London, Inter Milan in Italy, and he will probably continue in the same vein at Real Madrid, although I imagine Barcelona will have something to say about it. However, in contrast to Mourinho, Brian Clough achieved similar success with small provincial clubs like Derby County in 1971 to 72, and again with Nottingham Forest winning the league in the 1977 to 1978 season, winning the First Division, I should say, which is the equivalent of the Premiership now. However, with Nottingham Forest, he then achieved a feat that has never been repeated by a British manager, winning the European Cup twice in back-to-back seasons. And I should explain, of course, that the European Cup is the equivalent of what is now the Champions League. As you watch this film, I want you to consider whether, despite the fact that this plot is obviously based on real life, whether this script is perhaps shaped to resemble something like a morality play. And by a morality play I mean an allegorical play in which virtue is usually seen to triumph over evil, or in which vices, negative, unfavourable characteristics are punished. Brian Clough, as the protagonist in our film, is guilty, I think, of overreaching pride, or what the Greeks would call hubris, and in the manner of Icarus, who flew too close to the sun, suffers an inevitable downfall. We can also see him, I think, perhaps as a Faust figure. Now Faust, as those of you Germanists may know, is the professor of German legend, from the 16th century, who famously sells his soul to the devil in return for power and knowledge, and is ultimately damned. Similarly, Clough does a deal with the damned United in return for a shot at ultimate power in English football. And of course, for those of you who know Goethe's version of Faust, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's version of Faust, you'll know that at the end of Faust Part 2, Faust is redeemed by the love of his life, Gretchen. And I think perhaps we can draw a parallel between Gretchen, the figure of Gretchen, who redeems Faust, and the figure of Peter Taylor, who redeems Brian Clough, possibly. Okay, well, thanks very much. Bye-bye.